Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Carol Newcomb-Alutto. I'm on the CMC Board of Trustees. It's great to see everyone today, and we have a great day with a marvelous view of our city out there. Today's forum, Police Body Cameras, Benefits and Challenges, will explore the mirrored issues of police body cameras. Please take note that this is the first of two forums. Today we will explore points of view from the city, law enforcement, and the ACLU. Then on Wednesday, June 22nd, we will cover points of view regarding privacy matters, public records, and technology. These forums are both sponsored by Event Marketing Strategies. Won't you please help me thank them and welcome Jeff Milgram, President and Founder, to the stage to introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Carol. Good afternoon. As a longtime board member and past vice president of Central Ohio Crime Stoppers, safety's always been a very important issue for me. Safety for my family, safety of members of the Central Ohio community, citizens of Columbus, and especially the safety of all of our law enforcement officers who put themselves in harm's way every day, protecting all of us on the job. At Event Marketing Strategies, we are pleased to support the mission of the Columbus Metropolitan Club to convene and engage in meaningful conversation on topics important to our community. Today's a perfect example of both the need for a conversation and the bringing together of key people who will make an impact of the ultimate outcome. So please, let's welcome, to my right, Public Safety Director of the City of Columbus, Mr. George Speaks. And on the far right, former Ohio Supreme Court Justice and partner at Crabb, Brown & James LLP, and also counsel for the National Fraternal Order of Police, the FOP, Andy Douglas. And in the middle, one of our other panelists today is Chief Lobbyist for the ACLU of Ohio, Mr. Gary Daniels. Gary? And now let's bring to the stage our host for today and anchor at WBNS 10 TV, Jerry Revish. But first, to start off the conversation, I have the honor of introducing a man whom I first met in 2007 when he joined Columbus City Council and soon after took over as head of the Public Safety Committee of the City of Columbus and worked with us at Crime Stoppers very closely and did a great job working for us. And here, 9 years later, at his very first Metropolitan Club Forum, please help me welcome our mayor, the Honorable Mr. Andy Ginther. Mayor?
Good afternoon, and thank you, Jeff, for that kind introduction. I do want to give a warm Franklin County welcome. We are fortunate to have a special guest with us from Hamilton County, where the best thing in my life came from, the northeast side of Cincinnati, my wife Shannon. But Hamilton County Prosecutor Joe Dieters is here, so thank you, Prosecutor, for being here. I'm excited to join you today in one of the most important issues facing this community and this country, and that is the relationship between law enforcement and the communities they serve. And specifically, we're talking about body-worn cameras. The Columbus Division of Police represents the highest ideals. Men and women put their lives on the line every day to protect ours. Day in and day out, they perform their duties with honor, integrity, and effectiveness, reducing the number of violent crimes in our community every year, even as our population is on the rise. It is important to recognize that it is more challenging than ever before to wear a police uniform. We are painfully aware that police in cities around the country are facing unprecedented challenges in their relationships with the communities they serve. Columbus has averted the fate of many other cities. But because we have been fortunate does not mean we are immune. As outstanding as our police and our residents are, there's always the possibility of a tragic incident that results in divisions and discord that we have seen in other cities. That is why we are doing all that we can to increase transparency, trust, and accountability, including adding body-worn cameras to the tools used by our Department of Public Safety. According to a recent national survey, 95% of all large police departments are planning to proceed with body-worn cameras, having either already implemented or expecting to add this policing tool. Police organizations, including the National Fraternal Order of Police, have provided guidance for best practices as police forces throughout the country equip their officers and develop policies for implementation. Last year, former Mayor Coleman and I appointed a committee of leaders from across the community, from the faith, FOP, neighborhood and community leadership. Some of those members are here today, including Bo Chilton from Impact Community Action. This group will help us determine the most effective and efficient way to incorporate body-worn cameras in Columbus. It's chaired by our Safety Director, George Speaks. The committee will soon release its recommendations. Another committee has carefully crafted our request for proposals for vendors who can provide the body-worn cameras and technology associated with implementing it. The RFP was released yesterday and is available for review, consideration at columbus.gov. These committees continue to work diligently and collaboratively to create policies and find equipment that work for Columbus. And I want to thank them and recognize them for their service. Body-worn cameras are not our only tool. We have also invested in bike patrols, walking crews, community liaison officers, school resource officers, social media outreach, and our Diversity Recruiting Council, and listening tours to engage with communities, keep communication lines open, and build trust and goodwill. We'll be announcing just on Friday a community safety initiative led by Chief Jacobs and Commander Cameron that engages and uses community policing more than ever before in our summer work. These efforts have achieved results. Citizen complaints about police have declined each of the past 4 years. Working together, we will ensure that we continue to have the best trained and best equipped police officers in the region and in the nation, so they can protect the public and protect the public's trust. Instituting body-worn cameras will not cure all police community conflicts. However, I expect that this new law enforcement tool, blended with ongoing training and support resources, will promote more positive interactions, enhance public safety, and strengthen Columbus neighborhoods. We will get this done, and we will get this done right, and we will all be safer for it. Thank you very much. Look forward to the conversation. Thank you, Jerry.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you very much. Well, it's certainly a subject that we all have an opinion about and a perspective on. When you think about the evolution of where we are today, I take 1991 as sort of an inflection point. The Rodney King case, where a man took a video camera and shot that whole encounter between he and the LA Police Department. Fast forward to some of the things we've seen today, including the University of Cincinnati police officer situation down there in Cincinnati. We heard Mr. Dieters talk about that passionately in his remarks around that case. There's a lot to mine today, and we're going to get right to it. I want to ask all of our panelists this question. What should a good policy on body cameras include? What should it look like? Director Speaks, we'll start with you.
Well, we have worked for 6 months now, a little over 6 months, to craft what I believe will be the best body camera policy in the nation. So how do we do that? First, the mayor assembled an amazingly talented, diverse committee. We have looked at national best So as to not reinvent the wheel, we have looked at national best policies from across the nation, the ACLU, the FOP being two of the 4 national policies. We've looked at over 25 policies from various jurisdictions around the country, and we've learned from those. We've learned not only from their successes, probably more importantly, we've implemented or put into our policy many things in which they made mistakes, and we learned from their mistakes. So we did not reinvent the wheel. I think we took the best that was out there and learn from others' mistakes. And at the same time, we were able to craft a policy that's tailored to Ohio's unique law with respect to public records. So we will be presenting to the mayor next month. First, a policy. Again, I think it will be one of the best policies in the country that will balance the interests of transparency and privacy. And second, some various Ohio revised code changes that will ensure privacy as we utilize this new technology.
Mr. Daniels.
For those of you who know what the ACLU does, you might expect that this is a very complex issue for the ACLU because it involves a whole lot of issues that we take an interest in. So you're talking about police accountability. You're talking about personal privacy, and not just the privacy of the public, but also the privacy of law enforcement. You're talking about open government, government transparency, public records, those types of issues. And sometimes these issues can be in conflict with each other. And at the ACLU, we're so open-minded, we even disagree with ourselves about what these policies should be like. But roughly speaking, when you're talking about what goes into any policy, it's pretty uniform no matter where you are. So you're talking about when should cameras be activated? When should they be deactivated? Should there be notice given to the public that they're being recorded at that time? What do you do when you go into people's homes in non-emergency situations? What do you do when you encounter people who are crime witnesses or victims or informants? How should this all be handled in a public records arena? And that's where you see some conflict between personal privacy and public records. So these are complex issues, but they're certainly not insurmountable. And on the ACLU end, we would not only like to see good policies with law enforcement agencies and entities across Ohio, but we would also really like to see some statewide legislation that sets out some basic parameters and mandates for municipalities across Ohio without interfering or being too burdensome to law enforcement. I think that can be done. It's something that I've been spending an awful lot of time working on so far without much success in the General Assembly over at the State House there, but hopefully that will be coming because interest, I think, I've been with the ACLU for almost 20 years, interest is at an all-time high right now in my experience among the general public as to how the police conduct their business and why they make certain decisions.
Thank you. Judge Douglas.
Jerry, if I might, before I start, correct the record. My partner, Larry James, is the general counsel for the National FOP. And when we get back to the office, if I hadn't done that, I wouldn't have a job. I don't disagree with the other two speakers, except they live in a world of policy making. I live in a world where we have to deal with it practically. And the practical aspect of all this is that on June 14th, I'm going to be arguing the case before the Ohio Supreme Court on whether or not footage from body cameras is a public record. You know, case emanates out of Hamilton County, and I'll probably have a little bit more to say about that in a few minutes. But the practical matter that they're talking about is, sure, go through the General Assembly, and I'm fine with that. In fact, I suggest in our brief to the court that they defer this to the General Assembly because that's where these policy matters should be made. But the court is going to have squarely before it the issue. Does the press have a right, 5 seconds after that camera is turned on, to have a direct feed into that camera, no matter what it shows and what it's going? That's the issue, and that's the world I live in.
Thank you. Director Speaks, let's talk about how this is going to work. How many officers are going to wear them? Who's going to wear them? How long are they going to be on? All of that.
So great question. That's the first issue that we tackled on the committee. Who should wear the body camera committee? You'll find that when you look at national policies, many times there's a continuum, and there's a continuum on that question. The ACLU, for example, in their policy believes that every officer who has the ability to make an arrest, which in Columbus would be 1,856 as of today, should have a camera. On the other end of the spectrum, you have a study funded by the Department of Justice, and I believe that's the way our committee is going to go. First responders. I believe the committee is going to recommend that approximately 1,432, not all of our officers, will have cameras, and that's the first responders. And the reason that a blanket policy doesn't fit here in Columbus is we are one of the largest law enforcement agencies in the country. We have many folks who are not quote-unquote first responders who have secondary type jobs. For example, we have 20 helicopter pilots. They will not be interacting with the public. There is no need to put cameras on these folks. Secondly, we learned from a mistake. In Las Vegas, they quickly implemented cameras. They purchased one for every first responder. They soon realized cameras break. They did not include any extra cameras for that. So the recommendation to the mayor is going to be 1,400 and approximately 32 cameras plus a 10% cachet for malfunctions and breakage.
Have you put a price tag on all that yet?
The committee is still formulating that. Roughly, the direct cost will be approximately $8.5 to $10 million, and we're finalizing those numbers to outfit 400 or the 1,432 plus the cachet. The cost, really, the most expensive part of the cost is not the camera, roughly $1,000. The most expensive part is the storage. You all have cell phones. You know how tricky the storage can be and how much you pay for storage. Think of that multiplied by 6 hours a day or so, which is a guess right now. We're basing our calculations on an approximation of 6 hours a day of footage. We won't know until we actually implement, but multiply that by 1,432 cameras. Also include a records retention schedule in which you save law enforcement materials for at least 2 years, if not more. In the case of felonies, it could be forever. The storage and the terabytes that are taking up quickly becomes expensive.
So Gary, when it comes to personal privacy and the right of the public to know, where do you come down on this? I mean, how do you want the officers to use these cameras, or rather their administration to use what they gather?
Well, I think first, as far as a general policy or again, hopefully an eventual law, what we want is to start off with, we want law enforcement notifying people at the earliest opportunity that they are in fact being recorded. And that is also a benefit to law enforcement. I've been around long enough, I saw how this happened with dash cameras, where you had some law enforcement out there saying, we're not so sure about this dash cam business. And then what they quickly discovered is that these issues of people claiming they were mistreated by the police or evidence was planted and things of that nature diminished because here you have it on camera. So being surveilled, as the ACLU knows, changes the behavior of the public. So we want everybody basically to be on notice that in fact they are being recorded. And then we think there should be some real common sense kind of guidelines, restrictions, mandates, what have you. For instance, if you're going into somebody's home in a non-emergency circumstance, an emergency circumstance, a raid, somebody answering a violent act, domestic violence, things of that nature, we absolutely want officers to have their cameras activated to see what's going on. But at the same time, whether it's an emergency circumstance or a non-emergency circumstance, that can impact people's personal privacy in a variety of different ways. Now, I think some people are actually a little bit too worried about that. They think, like, for instance, the cameras are going to pick up people's credit card numbers and bank account numbers and passwords and everything. And if you've ever seen footage from a body camera, it just doesn't work that well. At least, not yet it doesn't. But where privacy really comes into play is in the public records arena. It offends every fiber of my being as a civil libertarian to talk about further exemptions to Ohio's public records laws. But I think that's going to be necessary when you're talking about recordings that impact people's personal privacy. Director Speaks has said it, and so I'm saying this because I didn't steal it. I say the same thing myself. But oftentimes when people encounter law enforcement, it's the worst day of their life. They're a victim, somebody they know is a victim, something horrible has gone on, and we have a general saying at the ACLU that public records should be so that we keep an eye on the government. Public records should ideally not be so that we can keep an eye on each other. And when you're talking about hours and hours and hours, hundreds, thousands of hours of recordings out there, it's going to capture an awful lot, good and bad. And we think there can be some exemptions out there that both preserve the ability of the ACLU, the media, and everybody else to figure out what exactly went on with particular incidents, while at the same time hopefully redacting information or removing information from public record that serves no real interest whatsoever other than to embarrass others or be sensational or what have you.
Judge Douglas, I think you want to get in on this.
Sometimes it's a little difficult for me to agree with the ACLU. But let me tell you the practical aspect. It's fine, the utopia you talk about is fine, but let me set the scene for you. In Cincinnati, a call came into the police department in Cincinnati that an officer was needed at the scene of a crime. The officer is dispatched, the officer gets out of his car, and the person who called shot the officer to death, as it turns out. The officer is lying there in the street. Up comes another officer with a body camera, captures this whole matter, with the officer bleeding to death, lying on the street. And 3 days later, the widow of the officer who was killed comes to your office, the office of Joe Dieters, the Hamilton County prosecutor, and says, "Please don't release that tape. I have a 6-year-old and 8-year-old son, and they're having trouble dealing with this." And Joe said, "I'll do what I can now, but it'll have to be released." Or take the problem when the prosecutor's on his way back from another location, and he gets a call and said, "Do I have to release the tape?" An officer in Cincinnati, from the University of Cincinnati Police Department, had shot an unarmed man and killed him. He was stopped because he didn't have a front license plate. Immediately the press says, "We've got to have that tape." The prosecutor has a position, has to think about the community safety. He remembers what happened recently in Ferguson and in Baltimore. He has to think about the protection of the witnesses. He has to think about the grand jury. He has to think about, does the public right to know Trump? Oh, I shouldn't have said that. Does it exceed the expectation of the press, the public's right to know? Those are the problems he had to deal with. And so if you'll take the sheet that I handed out to you, you'll see that on Sunday the shooting occurred. On Thursday and Friday he gets a demand for the release. On Friday that same day, for all of his efforts with regard to protect the community, which was up in arms, he gets sued at 5:18 that night. Within a few days, he convenes a grand jury and he releases the tape. Now he has to appear in the Supreme Court defending what he did. And I ask you, was it a reasonable time? Because that's what the statute says. He has a reasonable time before he has to release it. Was it a reasonable time? And did he do and balances his job to protect the community and the safety and the witnesses and the sanctity of the grand jury? Or should we give a direct feed from every body camera into Mr. Revish's newsroom? That's really our issue.
Thank you. So, Director Speaks, who's going to decide who releases the video and what video is released?
So let's take a step back for one second. So here's what we're talking about. We're talking about two potentially conflicting interests. On one hand, body cameras have been shown through studies and statistics to be wonderful in terms of better behavior, for lack of a term, better behavior. Specifically, in Rialto, California, there was an 87.5% less complaints against police officers after they introduced body cameras. Likewise, there was a 59% less use of force due to body cameras. Phoenix, 40% less in complaints. Body cameras were first introduced in Europe, and the first studies were done in Europe. In England, they found that there were much greater guilty pleas, as I think that we'll find body cameras will be a great tool for prosecutors. I'm a former prosecutor. I've talked to our prosecutors. They are looking so forward to that aspect of body cameras. Likewise, they found less assaults on officers in England. So you have accountability and transparency on one hand. And for that, you need body cameras on. But on the other hand, you may have a person on the worst day of their life, the most humiliating day of their life, and there are now 500 YouTube channels that post body camera videos. In fact, some folks are making money by making public records requests. Therefore, when the public watch, they receive money every time there's a hit. So you have these two competing values, if you will, transparency, accountability versus individual privacy. So our committee has done two things. We have tried to craft a policy unique for Ohio's records law to balance those two. Secondly, we're going to hopefully work with the ACLU, the Ohio Newspaper Association, the FOP, and get to the legislature and craft some additional exemptions to the Ohio Sunshine Law in order to protect that privacy.
Mr. Daniels, I want to ask you this. It's sort of a con, pros and cons. This is a con sort of thing, a concern that some folks have about cameras. Use of body cameras may prevent people from coming forward as credible witnesses to help assist in investigations due to fear of retaliation or fear of public exposure. Do you buy that argument?
I think for good reason some people will have that fear when it comes to body cameras, but that doesn't mean that it's not a solvable problem. I think if you can exempt from public records or not record in the first place, in some instances, a person who is a crime victim, a crime witness, an informal informant, if that's a term, not an official police informant, those are the types of things I think it makes absolute sense that you don't have as available as public records because of the potential danger to the witness, to the victim of the crime, and what have you. So it's we generally agree with that kind of exemption because it both protects personal privacy and allows law enforcement to do their jobs.
Justice Douglas, looks like there's going to be a need for some revision, some policy changes, some regulations coming down from the state on this. How do you see that playing out here, and how quickly can we get that accomplished?
I can tell you that there's a bill before the General Assembly now, and they're going to go home tomorrow or today or yesterday, whatever day it is, and they're not coming back until after the general election. Meantime, we have to deal with the problem because, as I tell you, it's going to be before the Supreme Court on June 14th. How do I see it working out? My hope is that the court will defer the matter to the General Assembly so there can be a statewide policy. For instance, I sat in a meeting just this week with the Attorney General's task force on police regulations or some such thing. And there's a safety director from a city not very far from here, a female, who said to me when she was asking me about the case, we're not going to have body cameras. We decided not to have body cameras because what happens, this is a lady, what happens when you walk into our house and on a domestic violence or some other charge, and there's the lady of the house in her panties and bra? Should that be on the 6 o'clock news? And down at the end, the police chief said, oh, we don't turn them on if we don't have to. Some places require the policies I've seen that they be turned on. So the direct as soon as you have interaction with the public. So the direct answer, Mr. Revish, to your question is, I do not see it occurring on the short term. I think there will be pronouncements come out in the short term that may not, in fact, be conducive to solving the problem, but courts are in a position where they have to balance and make decisions and decide cases. So I don't think it'll be very quickly, but do we need to? Yes. And the other point I would make is I think it should be a uniform policy throughout the state, because if you have in Delaware somebody not turning them on only at their discretion, and somebody in policeman Mayor Ginther requiring somebody in Columbus to turn them on, there will inevitably be conflicts. We just had a shooting out in 480 where we had 5 police departments, all with cameras, different angles. And the policy has to be the same, I think.
So, Director Speaks, Do you envision a whole new department of videotape review when the tapes come in and you all have to look at that stuff? How are you going to do that?
So we are not reinventing the wheel here. Public records has always been a part of the job that we do. We have a public records unit. So these issues dealing with public records is not new. What we're talking is additional exemptions that may be required under the current existing law. So no, we will have to undoubtedly augment our public records unit for two reasons. First, undoubtedly based on what's occurred around the nation, there will be more public records requests. Secondly, I am sure that prosecutors are going to love body cameras and undoubtedly will want to utilize them in their cases. So from the criminal justice system, we will also be receiving more requests. So that is one of those indirect costs that it's very difficult to quantify now. But the mayor has already granted us approval for 3 additional positions. And once we start rolling out cameras, we'll reevaluate to see whether that's enough. But again, let me underscore, this is not a new issue, public records.
Sir.
Thank you, Jerry. Director, what would you do if the Supreme Court on the 1st of July says that all the footage from every body camera is a public record, that closes it with none of the exceptions under 149.43, and you have to release it immediately, and that's the court order? What would you do?
First, I don't think the court would ever issue such an order. First, a public records are defined in law. A public record is, and correct me if I'm wrong, that which documents the function of the government. So a shooting situation would document, it is a public record, but I believe would fall under the law enforcement investigatory exception, which I believe is the crux of the case that you're going to argue. On the other hand, if the officer is going to the restroom, that certainly does not document the functions of the government and therefore is not a public record. So I believe Ohio law is already applicable to the great vast issues that will arise, and we're simply going to have to augment current law to include some additional redactions.
So you'd let prosecutors and lawyers redact the tapes?
So a law enforcement exception right now is an exception to public records law. I agree with you in that I don't think that we have to give out that tape immediately, and I do not foresee Ohio Supreme Court mandating that. Which, let me add this, that is what makes this such a fascinating issue in Ohio. Again, you have this issue of transparency versus privacy. Some states have gone totally to transparency or privacy. For example, if you're in Florida, body camera records pursuant to statute are not a public record, which I think is a horrible policy because you don't get to the transparency aspect, which you want to show as a government. But because in Ohio, I believe they are open records, but subject to exemptions and therefore redaction.
In a few minutes, we're going to move to your questions, and we do have a microphone here in the center of the room, so we'd like you to step to the microphone, state your name and your question in brief. And before we take your questions, I'd like to ask one more. What kinds of cameras are we looking at here? Are we looking at eyeglass cameras, body cameras? Have you decided which model you're going to use?
Yesterday, a bid went out called a request for proposal, an RFP. There's about 30 different body camera vendors out there. We are still in the state of a somewhat new technology, much like the old VHS beta tapes. I'm sure that over time, the herd will be called, if you will, and we'll come down to a few. But I expect a great number of vendors to apply.
And how long will you keep the records? How long will you keep the tape?
So again, there's nothing new here. For example, we've been utilizing cameras in our cars or our police cruisers for a number of years. And so that's called the records retention policy. In general, if it's non-evidentiary, after 90 days, that film goes away. For example, officer, I'm new in town. Could you point out a good restaurant that's nearby? That's non-evidentiary. So in 90 days, that would go off our servers. On the other hand, if it becomes evidentiary, generally at least 2 years. In the case of felonies, and because you have post-appeal convictions, that tape could be kept literally forever. And therefore lies the expense I was referring to earlier in terms of the accumulation of terabytes over time.
I know you have some questions. Please stand, come to the mic, and ask your question. No takers? I can't believe it. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Raphael Davis Williams, and I am on the board of directors for the ACLU of Ohio. And I'd like to direct my question to Mr. Douglas. You've given a lot of extreme examples of a police officer bleeding and families, unclothed in their home. Are there any beneficial uses from your perspective for body-worn cameras by law enforcement officers as it relates to documenting what might happen, and as Director Speaks has mentioned, the assistance of law enforcement?
Yes, sir. Thanks for your question, and I can answer it directly. I should first of all tell you that I'm the person who wrote in the court that sunlight is the best antiseptic in several cases that we had. Secondly, years ago, I was awarded the Sigma Delta Chi's Outstanding Citizen Award for openness of records in the cases that I wrote. So I don't come to this as any arch conservative. I believe in the open records, and I believe, frankly, in body cameras. Body cameras are in a position to ensure transparency. The one thing we need to remember, though, let me go back to your question. I'm not giving you extreme examples, sir. I'm giving you examples that we see every day. Every day we have these problems with the body cameras and police shootings and those sorts of things. It may only occasionally get in the press, but I'm actively involved in 5 of those cases right now, trying to clear police officers where there was no question. It took 6 months to clear 5 police officers in Twinsburg, 6 months, when they had 6 body camera angles, and every one of them showed that the man was pointing a gun trying to kill people after he had just killed his son. So those are not unusual examples. What I would tell you, though, is I think the body cameras are useful, but that's a discussion there's no sense in us taking time with. That ship has sailed. Body cameras are here, and they're going to be here forever. And I think that they are useful, if that was your question.
Thank you. Next question.
Hello, my name is Jonathan Stewart. I have a question for Director Speaks. When you mentioned the additional augmentation of the Public Record Department, you mentioned that you was going to add 3 more people. However, you plan on outfitting 14, I'm a numbers person, I'm a business intelligence, so I love numbers, so if this is too many numbers, I apologize up front, because I'm about to just start throwing out numbers.
Just to warn you, I went to law school to get away from numbers, so.
But you're going to outfit around 1,400 first responders. And if they're going to record on average of 6 hours a day, that's about 43,000 hours a week, which makes about 2.23 million hours in a year. And with more exceptions, it adds even more time. So 3 people only have 6,200 hours total of work time a year. You need almost 360 full-time employees dedicating nothing but every second of the day to review all 2.23 million. If they were to review it at 50% speed, that's still 180 more people. So my question, after all the numbers, is how fast can you increase your augmentation? Because 3 people won't be enough. It's not going to happen.
So a couple different answers to that. First, not everything an officer records will be a law enforcement used for evidentiary purposes. So there's no need to review that. Secondly, at the end of a shift, the officer will go back and what's called tag. He will link that footage with a specific police report number, an incident number, so that the video is married with the written documentation. Therefore, not all of those hours need to be reviewed. Secondly, technology is becoming more and more amazing with respect to redaction. And I think in a couple more years, in talking to some of the countries who've presented to the committee, we'll find that there's even some even greater advances in efficiencies due to the technology. Third, we have surveyed law enforcement jurisdictions from around the country. Anywhere from 3 to 9 seem to be the augmentation of the public records unit. So that's something we want to keep very close tabs on. We're not going to actually know The 6 hours is a guesstimate, if you will. We're not going to know until we actually implement. And it's very difficult, again, to exactly figure out ahead of time exactly how much you'll need, relying on folks around the country, because the public records laws and the redaction laws are different wherever you go. But we've been assured that we will have the resources to perform the redaction and to respond to the public records request.
Okay, thank you.
Just to reemphasize what Director Speak said, an awful lot of times the cameras simply aren't going to be on or activated. So I know your question comes from the concern about cameras always being on an X number of hours over X number of officers. But certainly the Columbus policy and really every other policy out there I've looked at and reviewed talks about activating the camera only in like a law enforcement type situation. So as they're riding around in the car, as they're talking to people, doing different things, that stuff is not going to be recorded. And if there is a situation where they're not recording and something goes immediately wrong, you think you're just having a regular conversation with someone and they pull out a gun and they start going after the officer or something like that. Obviously, I mean, the ACLU wants cameras activated as soon as possible. We don't want any danger to the officers or bystanders or anything like that. But the wonderful thing with body camera technology right now, and I think we'll see this across all vendors if it's not already the case, is it buffers. So if something goes wrong and you activate it, it will basically back up and capture that previous 30 seconds, 60 seconds, 90 seconds, whatever you set it for. So you don't have to worry about, oh my goodness, I didn't have the camera on when it really should have been on, because again, you activate it, it captures that previous time, that previous event for the benefit of everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next question.
Hi, I'm Carol Newcomb-Alutto. I have a question about coordination in terms of, I'm sure there's some cameras, or I assume there's cameras throughout Columbus that the police department has access to, not personal cameras, but cameras on buildings, etc. I know OSU has a number of cameras that, record things. How are you going to coordinate those camera results with the body cameras? And do you do something like that now?
So in the city of Columbus, we have our neighborhood safety cameras, which have been wonderful. We look at crime analytics as to where to place these cameras, and our neighborhood associations and groups have simply loved them. That is one of the things that the RFP committee will be looking into. The problems you have with 30 different vendors is you have 30 different software formats, and not everything will merge together. So don't know the answer yet. Sir.
Hello, and my question's for Director Speaks. I'm Dave Franco. I'm with a company called NetApp. We provide data storage for video surveillance for places like Columbus Airport. And my question is really around policy and funding. So for the airport, for example, other funding comes from the Fed, and the Fed dictates their policy on retentions and how they can use that data. So my question is, for the city of Columbus, if any of our funding is coming from the state or from the Fed, even though we have our own committee to decide on our policies, are we forced by the fact that they're giving us money to change our policy to bend to their needs because they're giving us money? And I don't know if we're funded that way or not, and that's kind of my question.
The short answer is no. We are under the Ohio Revised Code, not the federal code, with respect to records retention and policy. With respect to funding, the mayor has made this a significant priority for the city of Columbus, and the mayor is utilizing general funds and perhaps capital funds, depending on how the RFP flushes out. But that will be coming from city funds. However, that is one of the things I would hope that the state legislature would take up, especially if they mandate body cameras, do not have an unfunded mandate, help municipalities and local law enforcement jurisdictions to offset the great expense and significant investment this is going to require.
Okay, so will we be at the mercy of the state then if that happens in determination of policy?
So currently there is Ohio Bill 407 by Representative Boyce and Grossman. That does not dictate policy. Rather, what that bill says is, here are the various issues in a policy that you must address, and each local law enforcement jurisdiction gets to craft their own unique policy, but they have to address each of those issues. Who knows what will happen with this legislature, but we fully support Representative Boyce and Grossman's bill.
Thank you.
And if I may ask, as we get ready to take the next question, is there a date certain on when body cameras will be on Columbus police officers and on the street?
So we released the RFP yesterday. We hope to contract, if everything would go according to plan, by mid-September, early October at the latest. And therefore, for implementation, we have an 8-phased implementation. The first phase would be in our traffic unit. That's for several reasons. First, there is generally not a what the judge would call an expectation of privacy on our public roads. Secondly, that allows us time to build the infrastructure. Again, learning from mistakes of others, some jurisdictions have bought these cameras. The officers go to upload them at the substations, and they find out that their communications infrastructure was inadequate. So we have done a survey of all of our substations. We need upgrades in approximately 9 of our substations to go to fiber. The mayor has set aside $1.4 million in our capital budget to do that. By implementing first in the traffic division, that will allow us time to, get the communications infrastructure going. Secondly, to hopefully be very careful to not violate the privacy of folks as the traffic unit works outside on our highways. And thirdly, by starting in the traffic unit, it allows us to, how should I put it? These are the more experienced folks generally in the division and leaders in our division, and I think folks will be more apt to follow their lead. If you look at incidents from around the country, many instances of public police discord have occurred in traffic situations. Cincinnati is a good example. So that's a great place in which to start.
And that'll start when?
Hopefully by the end of the year. That's our goal. So we will contract, hopefully mid-September, early October, with the initial phase of deployment in our traffic unit, hopefully by the end of the year. So December 31st.
Thank you.
Hi, Andy Campbell. Director Speaks, I had the privilege to talk to you about some of these issues as we prepared for this. I'm curious, and all of your opinions. One of the things you mentioned were about the YouTube channels and some of the kinds of things that end up. You mentioned, Gary, these, the worst day of people's lives when these things happen. What are the kind of things we should be looking out for? And certainly for Justice Douglas, really, should these be public records? These kinds of events or things that the videos capture.
Should they be public records? Was that your question? They're going to be public records. There are only 2 things that I would leave you with as we get towards the end of this. And the first is to tell the director on the 14th, your dash cams are up as well. The case is up for the dash cameras. The case should be argued at the same time. The second thing, to directly talk to your question, we all need to remember that the only thing those cameras show is what's directly in front of the officer. The officer may have a lot of other things going on with other people with weapons or other problems to the side. The camera only shows what's in front of him. And so consequently, when you get to the point where the prosecutor has to look at all the matters, for instance, if he had a chance to get up here and he'd tell you about witnesses who came forward to the grand jury who weren't even at the scene because the tapes get released. And that's what he has to deal with. So remember, the camera's only going to show what's in front of the officer. What's going on around him is something else he might have to react to and has to every day.
Thank you all. We're out of time right now. Let's give our panelists a round of applause. Let's bring our presiding officer, Carol Newcomb-Alutto, up to close us out. Thank you.
I hope you all enjoyed today's forum. You can view and share today's forum in all our forums on CTV Columbus Television and WOSU and PBS affiliates statewide through the Ohio channel and anytime on CMC's website via YouTube. Please thank our sponsor, Event Marketing Strategies. Thank you. And our speakers, Andy Ginther, George Speaks, Andy Douglas, Gary Daniels, and of course, Jerry Revish. Thank all of you for coming also.